so let's get into the Word a little bit. It's coming from Luke chapter 7. I've been preaching through the Gospel of Luke. If you have a Bible on your phone, you want to follow along with us, you can certainly do that. Or if you want to grab one of those Bibles in a chair in front of you. But Luke 7. Last week I talked about faith. In fact, I talked about a man who had unmatched faith, a centurion. And remember that message last week? If you missed it, you can see it on our website or our social media and that. But Jesus simply said the word, and this man believed that's all that was required. That was the faith that he had, unmatched faith. Amazing. Then Jesus does another healing, which we're going to see now in Luke 7, verse 11. But he doesn't do it by doing anything in the sense of laying hands on the person. We talked about that last week. He doesn't. They don't even ask. There's no faith that's actually seen in this passage. So I'm going to read this first part to you. Luke 7, you can follow along, verse 11. That's where we're at. So let's settle in. I know it's a little bit warm. You can do this. It's okay. But we turn the fans on. Hopefully it'll help a little bit. So verse 11, it says, "Soon afterward he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As Jesus drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, 'Do not weep.' Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, 'Young man, I say to you, rise.' And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, 'A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people.' And this report about him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country." It's quite a story, don't you think? What Jesus does, all the stories are amazing. But I just want to teach from this a little bit and help you understand what was going on here. First of all, I have a map of Nain. Where is Nain? If you have eyes good enough to look at the screen there, it's nice that it's color-coded, but the area that Jesus did most of his ministry is in the red, pinkish area. That's Galilee. That's where he spent 3.5 years, for the most part, doing his ministry. And Nain is a little city just south of Nazareth, which is where Jesus lived for 30 years before he started his ministry. So they're in this ministry of Galilee and in Nain, and Jesus and his followers. Now, this is about 1.5 years into the ministry. Jesus is very popular right now. He has a lot of followers because he's a healer and he's an amazing teacher. And so they're following him, so there's this big crowd, you can kind of picture it, big crowd walking into this town, but at the same time that this big crowd following Jesus is walking out is a funeral procession, and it says it's also a large crowd. So two crowds meet, one is happy, one is sad. And by the way, two only begotten sons meet, one is dead, about to be alive, the other's alive, about to be dead. Interesting. The widow was weeping, which is no surprise. Her only son has died. Jesus has compassion on her. He says, "Do not weep," because he knows what he's about to do. And he touches the beer. This is not proof, by the way, that Jesus drinks beer. As you can see, the word is spelled a little differently. All right, some of you were like, "Dang it, thought I had my proof text." No, you don't. The spelling's different. The beer here is a coffin, and the pallbearers stop dead in their tracks. Jesus, like before, simply says the word, and what he says is, I have the scriptures, you can put those up on the screen there. What he says is, "Young man, I say to you, rise." Now, personally, I think this would make a great movie scene. I'm not Dallas Jenkins, and I don't have my own show, but if I was to, have a movie here about this, I would definitely have this scene happening where the camera angle is right on that coffin, right? And Jesus says, "Arise," and then this man just pops up from the coffin, right? And starts talking. The scripture says he starts talking. Interestingly, I had a friend in college that had narcolepsy. My friend in college had narcolepsy, and this was the craziest thing because we'd all be sitting around in the living room just talking, bunch of, 20-year-olds, and all of a sudden, she'd be saying something in the middle of her sentence, she'd just fall asleep. And the first time it happened, I was like, what is going on? Is she drunk? Like, I didn't know what was happening. No, she has narcolepsy. But then here's what was really weird is she woke up like minutes later and finished her sentence. So bizarre. I wonder if this dead man whom Jesus raised back to life, if he rose up and finished his sentence. I'm sure he was confused about being in this coffin, but no doubt he was thrilled to see the smile on his mother's face. How did everyone else respond to this? Well, it says in verse 16 that fear seized them all because they knew this was supernatural. God had done something amazing. In fact, it says they glorified God. They gave him all the glory because they recognized that Jesus was, as they put it, a great prophet. They said, a great prophet has risen among us. God has visited his people. This is a very important statement that Luke makes. Luke is the writer of this gospel, and he is always trying to show that Jesus is fully human, as John shows fully divine. But he's sharing this story for, I think, an important part. And in fact, he's the only one who tells this story. This is the only time you see it in the Gospels. It's just in the story that Luke tells. And these are Jewish people that know the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, there is a prophecy about one who would come that would be a great prophet. In fact, I'll give you a little trivia question this morning. This is Old Testament trivia. Everybody, who likes trivia out there? We got some trivia people? Yeah, Old Testament trivia. Now, unfortunately, there's no prize for getting the right answer. Like Wednesday nights, if you come to my Bible study on Wednesday nights here at 7, I give out prizes. The Darlow family's on a roll. They've gotten a lot of the prizes. No prizes this morning. Just shout it out. It's kind of an easy one. Which prophet of God is the greatest in the Old Testament? Which prophet in the Old Testament is considered to be the greatest? I think I heard one person answer it right. A lot of us are shy. We don't want to get it wrong. Don't worry. There's no penalty. If you don't go backwards, it's not Jeopardy. All right. The correct answer is Moses. Moses. Pat yourself on the back. If you got it right, that's the only prize you're getting today. Even today, followers of Judaism believe that Moses is the greatest prophet. And for good reason, because he wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. When you read the first 5 books, that's written by Moses. He also gave him the law, which is the 10 Commandments, and then, of course, 603 more. Of course, he did not do all of this on his own. God worked through Moses to reveal his redeeming plan. And God has an amazing plan, doesn't he? You even heard that in the testimony of Ron, the purpose that he's worked out. God has a plan for your life. Well, God is working through Moses. Certainly he did in the Old Testament. We see that. But also something with Moses was very unique. God would speak to Moses like we speak to one another. He didn't do that with the other prophets. In fact, we find out that he did that or tried to do that with people, and it didn't work out. I'll get to that in a second. But Moses was certainly special. In fact, today we would say Moses was the GOAT. Now, if you're a little older, you don't know what that means. That's an acronym. That means greatest of all time. But I emphasize was. He was the GOAT because even Moses knew and proclaimed a prophet greater than him would come. It's in Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15 says this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers, and it is to him that you shall listen." He's going to be greater than me. Now, Moses goes on to say in this very same passage that incident where God tried speaking to the people. Remember when God gathered 2 million people at the base of Mount Sinai? And he began to speak to them the 10 Commandments. And Moses said, "You freaked out. Some of you soiled yourself." It was scary. In fact, they were so scared they said, please don't ever do that again, God. From now on, just talk to Moses. Let him tell us. And God was like, okay, I can do that. God said, from then on, he spoke to the prophets, or to the people through the prophets. Verse 18, saying something very similar to verse 15, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among your brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Now, in that verse is clearly a prophecy about one who would come, a greater prophet than Moses, a great prophet. And because of that verse, Judaism believes that God will send a special prophet greater than Moses, and he's going to do what Moses said. He'll teach God's commands to them. Well, as Christians, what do we understand? Who's the prophet? It's Jesus. And you should also know that Judaism believes God will send a king, a prophet and a king. The king is from the line of David, and they believe he will rule over the whole earth. They believe this because of 2 verses in Isaiah. Isaiah 9. Verses that we usually read at Christmas. So just so you know, this really isn't a Christmas verse. It's a prophecy about the king that will come and rule. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Verse 7, of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. Now, you might be wondering, okay, wait a minute. Where's he going with this? Because we're not in Luke 7 anymore. We haven't been in Luke 7 in a minute. What's happening? Well, in order for you to understand Luke 7, you need to know the backstory. And I'm big on the backstory, as many of you know. This is how I teach the word. I got to tell you the story that's happening behind it so you understand what's going on in the present or in this particular passage. So Judaism expects a prophet and a king. And even today, they are still waiting for the prophet and the king. I like to read this website that explains what Judaism believes. And when it comes to the end times, for someone who is a follower of Judaism, for them it's all about the Messiah to come. They call it the Mashiach. That's how they pronounce it. And I preached on this a few weeks back. As Christians, we believe the Mashiach has already came. He's Jesus Christ. He's the Messiah. He's the Christ. Christ means Messiah. Yet they believe he's still to come. And according to their website, the Mashiach will be both prophet and king. Listen to this is what they say. This is their end times view. When a great teacher and leader will arise, with the consent and the support of all peoples, this great person, this Messiah, this Mashiach, will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. That's in Israel right now. Okay? The Jewish people will all return to that place, to their homeland, and they will hear the deepest, sweetest teachings of Torah wisdom from this great teacher king. And it's not just for the Jews. The nations of the world will also live in peace and prosperity, as no nation shall lift a sword unto the other, and neither will they learn war anymore. So their view of the end times is peace on earth, literally. And this Mashiach will come and teach this and uphold this. Now, in that, you can see that they believe that this Mashiach will be 2 roles, prophet and king. But as we're going to see in a moment, it wasn't always like that. Because when Jesus came in the first century, the belief about the Messiah to come for the Jews back then, they weren't sure if it was 2 persons or 1 person. Would there be a prophet and a king, or would it be both? So keep that in mind as we read Luke chapter 7, verse 18 now. It's all about John the Baptist here. We heard about him in the beginning. We saw his birth. We saw his prophetic ministry. And then he gets locked up. He gets put in prison for being a little outspoken. Verse 18, the disciples of John the Baptizer, and by the way, that's Jesus' cousin, his cuz. They reported all the things Jesus was doing to John. And John called two of his disciples and said, go to the Lord, go to Jesus, and ask this question, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And when the men had come to him, they said, John the Baptizer has sent us to you, saying, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? Now be honest, a lot of us have read the Bible several times. You've read the New Testament. You've read the Gospels many times before. How many of you have read this passage and thought, why is John asking this question? Anybody been like that before? I've always been bothered by this for a long time. Like, why is John doubting that Jesus is the Messiah? I mean, John, you baptized Jesus. Like, you saw firsthand the Holy Trinity for the first time when it appeared on earth. You were the guy that did that. In Matthew chapter 3, it says when Jesus was baptized, it says immediately he went up from the water. That means he was immersed underwater. That's how they did baptisms. Baptize is actually, our word baptize comes from another word, baptizo. We just transliterated the word, and it means you immerse it underwater. It's a pickle. The best demonstration or the best analogy is to understand a pickle. How do you make a pickle? You baptize a cucumber. That's how you get a pickle. That's what the word means. So when Amari and Anila and Ron come back here, I'm baptizing them, just like Jesus, underwater, immersed. No sprinkling, no pouring, immersed. You with me on that? All right, well, anyway, he was baptized, and when he came up, the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. I don't know why. God's voice always is deeper than mine. It just always has to be that way. But John, you were right there. How can you doubt that Jesus is the Messiah? At least that's what I used to think. Maybe you did too. But I don't think that way anymore. I don't think John was actually having doubts. Because when you study the Word, you begin to discover things. And when you peel back the layers and you understand culturally what was going on. And from a Jewish standpoint, they believe, well, are you the prophet Moses told us about? Or are you the king Isaiah told us about? I think that's the question John had in his mind. Are you both? Or are you one of them? And that's why he asked the question. So Jesus is now going to answer the question. And how does Jesus answer this question? Verse 21. In that hour he healed many people of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many who were blind he bestowed sight. So in other words, Jesus was busy. He was doing a lot. And he answers them, go and tell John what you've seen and what you've heard. Blind receive their sight, lame walk, lepers are cleansed, deaf hear, dead are raised up. The poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Do you know anyone that when you ask them a question, it takes them like 10 minutes to answer it? Yeah? Some of you are smiling. My kids would probably say that I'm that guy. If someone asked me a spiritual question, they'd probably roll their eyes, sit back down in the chair, and say, we're going to be here a while. I'm sorry, but it's probably true. Or do you know anyone that really never answers the question that you ask them? They just start talking about something else, and you're like, that's not really what I asked you. Like, how is this relevant? Well, to be honest, that was Jesus. Jesus is answering this question, but not in any way that they had hoped he would answer the question. And Jesus did that all the time. He does it right here with John's question. Why does he do that? Why does Jesus answer questions that way? I'm going to tell you why. This will help you when you read the Gospels for yourself. When you read the Bible and you see, why didn't Jesus answer the question? Why is he saying this and why is he saying that? The answer is because sometimes, most of the time, their questions were short-sighted and narrow-minded, and frankly, they usually ask the wrong question altogether because they can't grasp the mind of God. We have these little finite minds, and we can't always understand these big answers. And John here asks a really short-sighted question. He says, are you the prophet or are you the king? And if Jesus said the truth of the matter at that point in time, they would have went, they wouldn't have get it. They wouldn't have understood. And John was not alone, by the way. The disciples of Jesus, they spent 3.5 years following him around, and they knew everything about him. And yet they still didn't understand, because when Jesus gets to the point, as resurrected, by the way, and he's about to ascend into heaven, you know what they asked Jesus? They said, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? In other words, are you now going to be the king that Isaiah prophesied about? And Jesus was probably just like, oh gosh. But he was pleasant, and he said, I know you don't understand. Don't worry about the time. Do what I've called you to do. I love that Acts 1:8, right? When you receive the power, you will be my witnesses in St. Clair Shores, Macomb County, Michigan, and to the ends of the earth. That's what he said. Well, Jesus goes on to talk about John and his ministry, to really affirm John in his ministry. Although he does point out, it's really kind of funny, and I'm paraphrasing here, Jesus was talking about his cousin John. He says, my cousin John was a weird dude. He is a weird dude. I mean, let's face it, you got to go out in the wilderness to talk to him, to hear him. He baptizes out there. He wears weird clothes made of camel's hair and a belt. And he eats wild locusts and honey? Yeah, he's a weird dude. I get it. He's not like us. And if you're honest, you probably have a weird cousin too, don't you? You know who it is. And if you don't, I'm sorry, hate to break it to you, it's probably you. Roll with it. But Jesus affirms John as a prophet. He says in Malachi 3:1, he quotes Malachi 3:1, he says, behold, I send my messenger. He will prepare the way before me. That's John. He prepared the way for me. And Luke says that when Jesus says this, when he affirms John as being from God, sent by God, as Malachi prophesied, it says everybody that got baptized by John was like, woo, yes. And everybody that refused that baptism was like, no, I don't want to do it. As we do on Friends, that one. But they jeered him. Some cheered, some jeered. They ridiculed. And Jesus then points out at the end of this passage how fickle this generation of Jews were. How fickle they were. Luke 7, verse 32. He said, you're like children sitting in the marketplace, calling out to one another, we played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you didn't weep. For John the Baptist, he came eating no bread, drinking no wine, and you say, he's got a demon. The Son of Man, that's me, I've come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him. He's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And then he says a weird thing, kind of confusing, but I'll explain it. He says, yet wisdom is justified by all her children. What is Jesus saying here? He's saying, look it, John and I are so different. We're on opposite ends of the spectrum, but you know what? We're both from God. We're both from God, and you have rejected us both because your hearts are hard and you're blind and you can't see the truth. What he says in the end is wisdom is justified by all her children. Children refers to their actions. Wisdom is justified by our actions. For the religious leaders judged John and Jesus by their actions. Only some of them, though. They recognized John was weird. Oh, he must have a demon. Oh, Jesus eats with sinners. Oh, he must be one. And Jesus said, look at all our actions. Look at everything we've done. Remember how we started the conversation? Look at all I've done. I've healed all these people. I've preached the good news. And if you see the whole picture, you'd understand. I'm not just a prophet or a king. I'm so much more. Now, in Judaism, they recognize three main offices, which is the title of the message you see on the screen: priest, prophet, and king. And I've shown you the verses for prophet and king, but now let me show you the one for the priest. Because the priests were special offices, a task by Levites. They were mediators between man and God, and they would offer a sacrifice for the people's sins. In fact, the high priest would go into the temple once a year on the Day of Atonement, into that place behind the curtain, the Holy of Holies, and they would offer the blood of the Lamb on the mercy seat for the people. And this went on for centuries after Moses established it. And Eli the priest was in charge, and his two sons were very corrupt. But Samuel was about to be lifted up as a prophet, or he was, and he prophesies about a faithful priest that will come. 1 Samuel 2, verse 35. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. This is God talking, who will do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. Now, you know today, as I've already said, in Judaism, they believe when the Mashiach comes, he's going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And there are Jews in Israel, I've read articles about this. They've already prepared the red heifer that needs to be sacrificed. They've already trained the priests. And they've been preparing for decades for this time when the Mashiach comes and establishes and has the temple rebuilt. Of course, there's a big problem, right? There's another building on the location. So there's all of that. But they believe that when the temple is rebuilt, that one of their own, a Jewish man, will become the high priest. And he will once again make sacrifices for their sins. He will go into that Holy of Holies and do it again like before. They do not see this as the Messiah's job. But as Christians, we see and believe it differently. Because who became the faithful priest that Samuel spoke about all those years before? Jesus Christ. He is all three: priest, prophet, and king. In Hebrews 4, and this should bring great comfort to you, we have a great high priest. He's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, and let us hold fast to our confession. We don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Whenever you fall short of God's perfection, which is, by the way, every day, like myself included, when you sin and fall short, you have a faithful high priest that offers you grace and mercy and forgiveness. That's the most wonderful news that you've ever heard. There is nothing better than that. That when you mess up and fess up, God cleans you up. It's beautiful. And by the way, if you're ever wondering, I don't know, man, I've done some pretty bad things. Or I've done it again and again and again and again. If you're wondering, hey, am I ever going to get there and Jesus is going to be like, you know what? Too much. Is he going to turn me away? Let me read to you from Hebrews 7, verse 23. The former priests were many in number. They prevented by death from continuing in office. But Jesus holds his priesthood permanently. He continues forever. He is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for us. Praise the Lord. He will always intercede for you because he died for you. Your sin may increase, but his grace abounds so much more, Romans tells us. So Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, holding all three offices. He's the greatest prophet, greater than Moses. In fact, Hebrews 3:3 even says it. Jesus was counted worthy of more glory than Moses. And he is the faithful priest that Samuel spoke about. For it says in Hebrews 9, he's the mediator of a new covenant. We don't worry about the old covenant. And he is the king Isaiah spoke about, as it says in Revelation. He's the ruler of kings on earth, and on his robe and on his thigh is his name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And if you're a Christian today, this message should bring you tremendous comfort. This is your Jesus, priest and prophet and king. And if you have yet to put your faith in Jesus, I hope that this will encourage you to do that today. Philippians 2 tells us, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed upon Jesus the name that is above every name. At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. In heaven and on earth and under the earth, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. All hail King Jesus. Amen. Our band is going to come up. If you desire to surrender once and for all, or if you need forgiveness again and again, or if you just need prayer, as we sing this final song, this is the altar. Please come up. If you just want to bow down before Jesus and surrender, please do that. Our prayer team will stand off to the side. If you need someone to pray for you, they will pray for you. But while this song is being played, please come to the altar and surrender to Jesus. Ask him for forgiveness, whatever's on your heart. And then following that, we will have our baptisms.